Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. Karen and I have been in Las Vegas for a while, so we didn't do a video for a while. So maybe I'll be rusty. Then I guess if I'm rusty, I could get some oil, and then I'll be like the Tin Man. Anyway, I want to thank our sponsor who's sponsoring today's lecture. His name is Matt, and he's at Los Angeles Legal Advocates, which is even better. Advisors sounds like they're taking your money. Advocates sounds like they're helping you. So Los Angeles Legal Advocates, Matt, thanks for sponsoring the lecture. And today's lecture is on the Steiner variation of the French defense. Not the most common variation, but it's a good surprise weapon, especially if you have the white pieces. And sponsor mentioned the move order that he plays isn't the normal one. And I actually wanted to talk about 3 or 4 different move orders and transpositions before we look at the games. So the main way of getting the Steiner variation is after black plays the French defense, white plays c4. That's the Steiner variation. And living in the US, which what I usually do, the best player that I saw who played this all the time with white was Boris Men. And I don't think Boris Men plays chess anymore. But in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, he was rated about 2550, 2570 USCF. He's an IM. And he would play this with white almost every game. Okay, now because usually black plays d5 and white can take either way on d5, we get some transpositions. Okay, and I'll show you what I mean. For example, if the game goes e takes d5, knight f6, d4, e takes d, which sometimes it does, this position can occur from an exchange French. And so remember this position. And I'm going to play an exchange French. And then slightly unusual to play c4, but not that unusual. And then knight f6. And also, assuming black captures on c4, which doesn't have to do. So let's play knight c3, and they take on c4, and I take back, which could happen. This is a variation of the Queen's Gambit accepted. And I'll show you how that happens. It's funny how an e4 and a d4 opening can become the same. And then e5 takes. And so you could get this position in the Steiner French defense, or you could get it from an exchange French, or you could get it from the Queen's Gambit accepted. You could get this position. And the thing to remember is, in probably 75% of the variations that we're going to look at, or that could happen to you if you have white is probably going to get an isolated d-pawn kind of position, which I actually like. If you're like, I hate isolated queen pawns, I never want to have one, this might not be the opening for you for white. Okay, now, the thing that the sponsor, Matt, wanted me to indicate was Matt plays the English opening. And occasionally, his opponents want to transpose into the Queen's Gambit declined, which we actually saw a lot in the 1980s in the matches between Korchnoi and Karpov for the World Championship in 78 and then in 81, which I guess 81 wasn't technically the 70s. E6, knight c3, d5, d4, this is a Queen's Gambit opening. And the sponsor of the lecture, he doesn't want to play the Queen's Gambit. So he decided he's going to play e4 and transpose into the Steiner variation of the French defense, which is what this lecture is about. So this lecture is about this position, and since it's called the French defense, the most common move order would be e4, e6, and then c4, but you could also play c4, and then after e6, play e4. The advantages for white aren't really chess advantages. It's a normal opening, it's fine. The advantage is, if you have this position with white, it's very unlikely that it's very unlikely black will have a lot of experience. And our sponsor has shown up, although he's a little late. So that's good. Okay, so you can get this position from more than one move order, and the following positions that you'll get on move 5, 6, or 7 actually come from more than one opening. And one opening I haven't mentioned is the Scandinavian. So if it's a Scandinavian and black plays knight f6, and what's funny is queen takes d5 was the most common, then knight f6 was the most common, and now I think they're about the same. But after knight f6, c4 is one of the main moves, and now black can play either c6 or e6. They're both book moves. And after e6, this is a well-known pawn sacrifice, and if white doesn't want to play that line, white can play d4, takes, and we can get this position from the Steiner variation of the French. So there's actually 3 or 4 different openings you can start with where you get these very similar, if not same positions. So the sponsor was interested for himself in this move order, and it's called the French defense, so this would be the main move order. And you have to assume, if you're going to play c4, especially after looking at the games in this lecture, that you're going to be better prepared than your opponent, because 95% of your opponent's preparation is on d4. That's what they're preparing for. And occasionally, a grandmaster will play queen e2. Occasionally, they'll play d3. And sometimes they'll play knight c3 and knight f3. And if you play the French defense with black, you should probably know that. You should have something ready. So very few French defense players are ready for the Steiner variation. And so it's a very good surprise weapon. And I found 3 players who would always have white in this position, and they had many, many games. So they had a lot of experience. Okay, now first game I want to look at is between 2 of the top French players, and this was played in 2012, so probably the 2 top French players, MVL, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and Étienne Bacrot. And MVL's not known to play something out of the ordinary to get his opponent out of book, but you can still do it. Okay, he played c4, which should make our sponsor happy, and then he played e4. Okay, and this is the starting position basically of the lecture, and in this position I found 2 moves that were quite common amongst grandmaster players, d5 and c5. And they lead to completely different positions, and c5 can lead to some kind of English opening that's symmetrical, or some kind of Sicilian. And sometimes you can't tell the difference. Okay, Bacrot played d5, cd, and again, if typically, but not always, white wants to take on d5 with both pawns, just keep taking. And the difference is, if white plays e takes d, some people think after knight f6 that this pawn sacrifice is fine for black, and therefore most people will play d4 and then transpose into this variation. And if you don't want to do that with white, then you take with the c pawn, which basically forces black to take back, and then you take on d5. And if you take on d5 with the e pawn and black takes back, it's the same position. So I think it's slightly more accurate if you want this position with white to take with the c pawn. Taking with the e pawn, black might play knight f6. If you like that position, it doesn't really matter. Okay, and here, usually black plays knight f6, which is what Bacrot played, but I have a game where black took with the queen, which is uncommon, but it's not terrible. Okay, and MVL played bishop b5 check. So sometimes white wants to hang on to his extra pawn, and sometimes he just wants to make work for it. So you get sort of both. Knight bd7, knight c3, and now the d pawn is defended because we block the queen. Okay, and then bishop e7, and then just play normal moves with white being a pawn up and black thinking, I'll just win that back later. I'm not in a hurry. h3 stops bishop g4. And we have a typical kind of isolated queen pawn position where I wouldn't say anybody's better technically, but personally, I like white in these isolated queen pawn positions because it's hard for black to play actively, and white always has these squares on e5 and c5 to put their knights. Okay, and MVL put his rook on the open file. And this is the kind of middle game that you'll see in this opening when black plays d5 and we see a lot of trades on d5. And we see this isolated queen pawn position. Okay, so here I wouldn't say anybody has an advantage, but I would say the better player would win most of the time. It's like equal, but it's the kind of equal that won't really end in a draw because it's dynamically equal. Black can play against the isolated pawn, and white can play actively by playing something like knight e5, and it's hard for black to improve their position. Black's position's fine, but if you said what's black's plan, I mean, black's pieces are where they want to be, so there's not much to do. Okay, so Bacrot traded on c3, which unisolates the pawn. I'm not a fan of. Now white has a nice pawn center. And just some trades. And the knight on b6 doesn't look very good. Now MVL has pressure here. b7, knight e5, as indicated earlier. And eventually, white wants to play either a5 or c5, c5 not being good because the queen's hanging, and try to win the b pawn. Now he defends his queen with rook e3, never play f6. And black's position just looks terrible. f6 weakening the black king, knight on b6 is terrible, and white has this nice pawn on d5, very passive for black. d6 is a really nice tactical move. If you take on d6 with the queen, I play c5 check with a triple attack. And if you take with the pawn, then you just lose your knight. So Bacrot didn't take. He played rook takes e3, knight takes e3, king f8 getting off the diagonal, and white's just winning. Rawr! White crashes through and then plays the really nice move c6. And that pawn is too strong. So black can resign here, but he played on a couple more moves. And this is a really nice finishing move from MVL. Probably with the pawn on the 7th, I should win eventually, but MVL won immediately, which is even better. White wants to play rook to c8, but it's defended too many times. So MVL played the move knight d5, and now if you take the knight, rook c8 wins immediately. White's going to promote. And I'm threatening knight takes knight. So you have to move your knight, and then I play rook c8. And Bacrot, realizing moving the knight loses to rook c8, and not moving the knight loses the knight, he decided to resign. What's funny is this was played in Bundesliga, which is the German league match system, and they're both French players, both playing for German teams. And the question is, when the game ended, did they analyze in French or in English? That's a funny story I have for another time. Okay. Next game is Korchnoi with white versus somebody I've never heard of, Kaenel. This was in the Swiss Championship 2001. Korchnoi, after he defected, eventually settled in Switzerland and played for the Swiss national team in Olympics and the Swiss Championship, and was Swiss champion many times. And Korchnoi, I actually found more than one game that he played in this line, because Korchnoi plays c4 sometimes on move 1, so he could play e4 and transpose. Okay, and that's what he did. And he played e4, thinking I'll avoid the queen's gambit, and my opponent won't know e4. It's not even clear when you play c4 move order on move 1, if you get this position, that your opponent has any idea of it, because your opponent doesn't necessarily play the French defense just because they play e6 against c4. They're just trying to play a queen's gambit declined or a Catalan. And so when you play e4, it's possible your opponent is like, what? Now what do I do? And so they're sort of out of their prep. And for somebody like Korchnoi, who's a better player than the other Swiss players, he doesn't want them rattling off 15, 20 moves of their prep. He wants them to play on their own early so he can show why he's a better player. So same thing. Everything's the same. And Korchnoi played bishop c4, and MVL played bishop b5 check, which is more common. Bishop c4 is fine. And again, white has an extra pawn, and black says, I'm going to win that pawn back. And so black eventually won the pawn back. Although I don't like black's queenside very much. And we have the same kind of pawn structure that we saw last game. And once again, we have c5 and e5 for our knights. And it's hard for black to get really active. And this pawn structure on the queen side isn't really what black wants. Pawns aren't very harmonious. And they just develop their pieces. Black's pawn structure is going to be a problem in the endgame with open c-file for white, pressing that c7 pawn. Eventually, black gets his queen in sort of a funny position. He doesn't lose his queen, but it's still strangely placed. And Korchnoi threatens mate, and then plays e6. Now, if I had the black pieces, speaking as a grandmaster, not a strong grandmaster, but still, if I knew my opponent was going to play knight g5, threatening mate, and then I was going to play g6, and they would play e6, that's not happening. I'm not allowing that to happen. So I don't think black has done anything terribly wrong here, but it seems like all those queen maneuvers left his knight not well defended. Conversely, Korchnoi's queen is in the center, perfect. And after black defended it and white went here, black really has a very difficult choice, because if black takes the knight, then his rook is attacked, and the rook is defending d5. So if you play rook d7, I have e6 again. It looks lost. This looks like black's getting punished. So I think after knight g5, Korchnoi winning. And I know after e6 he's winning, because I would never have black in this position. Okay, so he played f5, giving Korchnoi a passed pawn. Korchnoi threatened mate again. Ugh, h5. Ugh. Queen c4. And, I mean, with the pawn on e6, white should eventually win. The game ended with some very nice tactics. Now, funnily enough, queen b2 threatens queen h8 checkmate. That's why with black, you shouldn't move all the pawns in front of your king, unlike Korchnoi, who left them there. Takes the knight. In this position, white's threatening queen h6 with mate, all kinds of mates, and he's threatening queen takes b6. So in this position, black played c6. Probably black wanted to play knight d5. That looks pretty good. And then white played queen e3, threatening the knight and threatening mate. So I don't know if that's a time trouble blunder, or it doesn't matter, he's losing anyway. Now he just loses quicker. And in this position, black's just down a piece for nothing, so he resigned. So that was a good example of this opening where you're trying to get a position your opponent doesn't know, and then you're the better player, so you win. And I would argue MVL is a better player than Bacrot. So again, you're not winning by force. By playing this way, what you're doing is you're taking all of your opponent's prep out of the equation. And if you play this often, like our next three players do, I showed you these games because these guys are pretty good. And there are games where white is Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura, but those are typically blitz games. And I wanted to show you games that were played like in slow chess. Now, the next three people who have white, these are specialists of this opening. Okay? And one of them is so good I can't pronounce his name. Okay, so this is Aleksandr Rakhmanov. If you have a chess database and you look at Rakhmanov's games, or you look at this opening, there's a lot of Rakhmanov games. So he's the highest rated player in the world who basically plays this every single game. So if you ever have black against Aleksandr Rakhmanov, if you do, then he's going to do this. That's what he does. And he has more experience than you because he has dozens of games with white in this line. This was played in Abu Dhabi in 2014. I've never heard of his opponent, but his opponent's pretty high rated. Vlad Barnaure, 25-13. Again, the c4 move order. And this is different because I didn't want to show you the same first 7 moves every game. Black can also play c5. And in fact, probably depending on your level and your level of your opponent, you might see d5 more or c5 more. I don't know. But you'll see them both. And white has many ways to play here. He chose a very unusual way, which I thought was like fun. One way white can play, which I saw Nakamura do, was to transpose to a Sicilian with knight f3, and then d4, and then this. And this position, we could see out of a Sicilian if it went e4, c5, and then either e6 or knight c6, doesn't matter. Then first one, then the other. So knight c6, then e6 or e6, and then the move c4. Okay, so he played knight c3, and then played f4. And typically in Sicilians, which this looks like, but white's pawn's on c4, if you play f4, black will try to play one of three moves. b5, usually prefaced by a6 and rook b8, d5, or knight d4. And in this variation, since white's played c4 so early, it's very difficult for black to play d5 or b5. So he played knight d4. He played the third one. Now, I wouldn't play knight d4 if I was black, because I already moved my knight. I'd move my other pieces out. And then knight e2, he wants to kick the knight out and trade on d4, but not have his knight attacked on c3. So, for example, if white plays knight f3 or knight ge2, and then takes the knight, and I take back, your knight's attacked on c3. But he doesn't want his knight on c3. He wants his knight on f3. He's going to attack on the king side, because he's played e4, f4. So attack on the king side. Okay. So, knight ge7 was played. Takes, knight f3, knight c6. And now another unusual move, bishop d3. The reason is he wants to play e5 and start a kingside attack. Bishop d6. That seems like a very strange idea to force e5, losing a tempo. Finally, he plays d5. And they get this really interesting position where I like white, because white has kingside attack chances and black's bishop on c8 isn't very good. Bishop e1 I like. The bishop's going to come over to the king side, and the queen defends the b2 pawn. White starts an attack. And if you've played the first 20 moves of the game and you haven't castled yet, you could get in trouble. And white played f5, showing that black is going to get in trouble here. Now, if you take with the g-pawn, queen h5 looks very dangerous, attacking f7. I wouldn't want to have black in that position. He ended up playing bishop e7. Taking with this pawn seems like it's the most logical, although after bishop d5, I don't like black's position. Although I think I would have done this if I was black. Like if I castle, I don't like the looks of e6. This reminds me of the Korchnoi game. Okay, so he played bishop e7, and that's good he played bishop e7. It's funny, there's a lot of famous games throughout history that are famous because one guy did all kinds of attacking and sacking and mating, and it was exciting. And the reason this happened was his opponent made the moves which allowed this. So bishop e7, not the best move, but good for us, because now we see really exciting attacking, and we see how black gets punished for not castling and playing bishop e7. Actually, he played bishop d6, bishop e7, bishop c5, bishop e7. Those people need to be punished. Knight takes f7. Black took on f5. If you take on f7, I'm guessing f takes e6 wins, and I'm guessing f takes g6 wins. I can't believe that black can survive double check and the king's running around. Terrible. So, for example, here's a variation I'm looking at in my head, which means it could be wrong, but it's not, which is takes, double check. So black has to move the king. King's at, then check. Black has one legal move that I see. I'm not using an engine, so I could be wrong. And then checkmate. That looks good for white. And even if I didn't have checkmate, it still looks good for white. I mean, the king on e5 is ridiculous. Okay, so he played e takes f5, bishop d5, and black castle, which is very funny. And again, I mean, it's funny that I chose these two games the Rakhmanov game we're looking at now and the Korchnoi game, because once again, we have a pawn on e6, a knight on f7, and black has this pawn structure being castled. I didn't plan that, but that's what happened. White got a big attack in both games, and black was helpless. And this is just helpless for black. Black sacks the exchange. Always sack the exchange. Then white sacked the exchange, which isn't really an exchange sack because the knight is defending the bishop on e7. Then black resigned because after queen takes, white's up a piece. Also, white has a lot of threats. White's threatening bishop f7, queen d8. And if you play the obvious move that stops them all, I just keep coming. Now, I don't need to keep coming. I'm up a piece. But, I mean, just to show you how bad black's position is, it's going to be more than a piece soon. So after rook takes c6, black resigned. So that was a different kind of variation than we've seen previously by a guy who played very unusual with white, playing knight ce2 in the opening and bishop d3, and ended up winning pretty quickly against a pretty high-rated player. Okay, the next game is a guy who I think plays this opening more than anybody, and I think he was Lithuanian, and then he moved to Finland. And then if that didn't happen, people on the YouTube chat will yell at me and say that's not what happened. But I think that's what happened. His name is Normunds, Miezis, Miezis. I've seen his name a lot, but I've never pronounced it right. And again, if you have a chess database, this guy's white in this opening, probably more than anybody. Him and Rakhmanov are like that, son. Okay, now he played c4 again, just like our sponsor, and then e4. And he took with the e pawn, and black took back. Black could play knight f6 here. That's a different line. And he played d4. So now I would call this an exchange French because it's an exchange French where white played c4. But as I talked about earlier in the lecture, these things all transpose. And in the end, it's probably going to be an isolated queen pawn position for white, the same as most of the other games. And it does. And again, this position could occur from 3 or 4 different move orders. Like white's always playing CD, black's always playing knight f6 and taking it, white's always playing d4, and you get this kind of position. Pins the knight, then d5. D5 is a very, well, that's a move you can't take back. So that's not the first move I would think of, but since he's played this opening more than anybody, it probably is a good idea. He's stopping knight c6, because this knight is pinned, knight c6 is coming, and this pawn is super weak, because white didn't play h3 before black played bishop g4. So he plays d5 and he says, there's no knight c6 for you. G4, so this is forced. And white has a very active game. All of white's pieces are excellent. And once again, as we've seen in other games in this lecture, knight on b6, it's hanging out, but it's not doing anything as far as the center is concerned. Both sides just improve their pieces. Knight gets to d6. White dominates the e file. White gets the knight over to the king side and then plays f4. And black has a tough choice here because f5 is very annoying, but if you take, pawn takes is a very annoying pawn center for white. So I'm glad I don't have black here. f6, never play f6. That hasn't worked out this lecture. We've seen this pawn structure where black plays f6, typically to kick the knight out of e5. Here he's kicking out the rook. And e6 is very nice square for white. And, when black is just losing here, I have a knight on e6. You can't let my knight get to e6. So he tries to trade. This leads to tactics that are in white's favor, as we see here. And in this position, black can resign here, I think, because the pawn on e6 will eventually win the game. But he played knight d6 attacking the queen, and white has a very nice tactic here, which is rook takes c7. And everything is just defended and attacked just so that it works. If you take the rook, then you get mated. And if you take the queen, you're in a lost ending. But you better take the queen, because you won't get to an ending if you don't. So he did. So he played queen d8. Okay, he could take the queen, which I thought he did, and then this ending's completely lost because I have this pawn, rook here, the king's getting mated, my pawn's queening. So he played queen d8, which leads to more tactics. e7, that's a good tactic. Takes. Material's equal, but after rook d7, you don't have a good move. I'm threatening mate with rook d8, and I'm threatening your knight. So black resigned. So that was pretty similar to other games where black played f6, got in trouble with something happening on e6, and was just losing. Now, when the sponsor suggested this lecture to us, there was only one person I thought of. And so I had to find a game of his, because I'm American. I lived in the Midwest for at least half of my life. And when I lived in Michigan, the best player in Ohio, maybe the second best, unclear, depends what year it was Boris Men. So in the 1990s and 2000s, if you played chess in Ohio, probably Boris Men was the highest rated player in the tournament. And this tournament was played in Detroit, and I remember this tournament, even though it was 30 years ago. Boris Men and I tied for first. We drew each other and beat everybody else. And this was the next best player in the tournament, Erik Torman. Erik Torman was crushing me, but I ended up winning. Okay, and if you saw Boris Men with white, he would play e4, our first example of e4 in this lecture, which makes no sense because it's a French defense lecture. And after e6, c4. Boris Men always played c4. And his FIDE rating was in the 2400s, and his USCF rating was in the 2500s. So it was noticeable when somebody who's one of the best players in your area was always playing the same opening. Okay, and we've seen this before, and Torman played queen takes d5. It doesn't really change the position much. We still get this isolated queen pawn position that we've seen many times. Plays h3 to stop bishop g4. And again, this position could occur from the Queen's Gambit accepted, the Queen's Gambit declined, the French defense, and I want to say another opening, but I can't think of it. That could happen in the Scandinavian too, just less likely. It's possible. Bishop on b3 is really good, controlling that diagonal. White is very active and has e5 for his knight. Black is pretty passive. Lots of tactics, and black just decides to go down a pawn in an endgame and hopes to draw the pawn down endgame. Which, by the way, I would never play knight d7 here because I'd be too afraid my knight gets trapped. So knight d7 seems a little crazy to me, but it worked out okay. He just had to trade for the bishop and double his pawns, which I wouldn't do. But white still has the 3-2 majority on the king side. Doesn't really affect anything. And, this isn't really part of the opening lecture, but you saw that white got an advantage out of the opening. Black was struggling. And eventually white won the pawn up endgame with g5. And now it's 2 pawns up. And now black's just not resigning. 3 pawns up. Yeah, black made mistakes the last 5 or 6 moves by not resigning. That was the best move, but he kept missing it. However, here he found the best move. He resigned. So those were some wins for white in the Steiner variation of the French, which in this lecture happened more often with the move order where white plays c4 and black plays e6. The lesson, if you're going to have this position with black, is if your opponent plays c4 and you play e6 to play a queen's gambit, you have to know the move e4. If your opponent plays e4 and you play the French, you have to know c4. And if you have white and you play c4 or e4 on move 1, you can get this position, and more likely than not, you will have a greater understanding of the positions if you play it often with white, because the players with black aren't facing it very often. It's a little bit unusual. But you get these kind of isolated queen pawn positions often that I see in queen's gambits, and I like them for white. So if I had white, probably on my stream over the next while, if my opponent plays the French, I'll play c4, and then I'll have some more games in this line in case I do another lecture again. Again, I want to thank Matt from Los Angeles Legal Advocates for sponsoring a lecture. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife, Karen. Her email is karen@atlchessclub.com. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. I'll see you next time with more weekly lectures. Bye, everybody.